Welcome to the Sky Therapeutics podcast. I'm your host, Tara Torres, a clinical nutritionist, researcher, educator, and consultant specializing in areas of weight loss, autoimmune disease, gastrointestinal disorders, metabolic syndrome, and other obesity-related conditions. I help clients improve their health through proper functional nutrition, professional-grade supplement protocols, exercise recommendations, education, and support using a personalized, evidence-based approach. At Sky Therapeutics, we offer functional nutrition solutions for chronic disease and help our clients develop sustainable lifestyle habits that will last a lifetime. As a friendly reminder, the information and opinions provided here today is to be taken as general information only, and you should always contact your personal physician or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about your personal health and wellness. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode where we are discussing gastric cancer and nutrition with Dr. Michael Robinson. I know Dr. Michael Robinson through my studies at the University of Western States, where I'm currently attending and completing a doctorate in clinical nutrition. Dr. Robinson taught my immunology course, and we spent several weeks doing nutrition oncology, and I have been obsessed and completely fascinated with this particular subject because I feel like it's such an underserved area in nutrition and the medical community in general when it comes to nutrition and lifestyle interventions. So, of course, I felt like Dr. Robinson was the perfect person to bring on as a guest speaker this week, and he's going to dive into the ins and outs of nutrition. We talk about calories, we talk about macronutrients, we talk about fiber and like specific nutrients that you should focus on if you have it. Dr. Robinson is a naturopathic doctor who specializes in naturopathic oncology in the Chicago suburbs. He's the owner of Nourish Healthcare, which is a multidisciplinary natural healthcare clinic and manages a team of multiple naturopathic doctors, nutritionists, and acupuncturists, as well as serves on the staff of Air Clinic, which is a contemporary medicine and the oldest IPT low-dose chemotherapy clinic in the U.S. He's also, like I mentioned, a professor of oncology and immunology for the University of Western States. Dr. Robinson holds a bachelor's of science in health sciences, a master's of science in applied clinical nutrition, and a doctorate in naturopathic medicine. He is certified in oncology nutrition via the Oncology Nutrition Institute and is a licensed naturopathic physician, a licensed dietitian nutritionist, and a certified nutrition specialist. So without further ado, please stay tuned. We will go ahead and dive right into our conversation. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out after. Thank you again for joining me this morning. So we're going to be talking about gastric cancer, and Dr. Robinson is joining me today. I know him through my studies at University of Western States. We actually did a course on, well, a couple-week course on oncology. So I'm excited to pick your brains a little bit more about gastric cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about you and like your practice? Because I follow a little bit of you on social media, and I think you guys just opened up a new office, right?
Yes, so I'm in the Chicago suburbs. I own Nourish Healthcare. So we have 3 different locations in the Chicagoland area, Downers Grove, Darien, and Burr Ridge. We just opened a new Darien office just so that we could kind of bring more therapies into one space and didn't have to have necessarily people jumping around all over the place.
Well, that's exciting. Congratulations. Do you feel like this is an underserved area, specifically when it comes to nutrition and functional medicine, the area of oncology?
Oh, definitely. The number one recommendation for food and diet by oncologists is ice cream. And kind of, I think everyone, even the layperson, knows that that's not necessarily the healthiest recommendation out there. So for sure, it's a wide, giant need in the healthcare space.
And you treat several different types of cancer. Obviously, there's more common cancers, and maybe we can have you back and talk about that on another day. But today we're specifically focusing on gastric cancer, which I found was pretty common. Something like 28,000 new cases would be diagnosed in the US. And even deaths, like somewhere around 10,000 deaths were reported in 2017. Now, typical treatment for this is going to include surgery.
Definitely in the early stages of it. And I mean, that's kind of all cancers. If it is stage 1 or 2, hopefully a surgical removal can almost be curative. It's just that a lot of times it's not found until it's much later than that. And then they might try to do a little bit of what's called surgical debulking, just get the big part of the tumor out of there. But after that, there's definitely going to be other treatments involved, whether it's chemotherapy or radiation for sure.
Mm-hmm. Um, And surgery, I remember you saying in class was like one of the top recommended things. Like if we can surgically resect any tumor of any kind, that's the preferred method, right?
Yeah, anytime you can go from having millions of cancer cells to not having millions of cancer cells in your body within a course of a couple hours, that's definitely a preferable treatment plan. The unique thing about gastric cancer, though, is as opposed to breast cancer, it's like, of course, breast cancer is not fun cosmetically, but you can certainly live without breasts without major changes to your health. Or colon cancer is, you have 25 feet of intestines. And of course, I don't want to just go chopping things off, but people can do pretty well when we remove 6 or 12 inches. The thing about the stomach is it's a very small organ and they like to remove a whole bunch of it. And when you remove a piece of the organ, a lot of function is messed up. And like I kind of said, is 25 feet of intestines. When you screw up the first 12 inches of your digestive process, you remove the stomach acid production part of digestion, the very first step of digestion, a lot goes wrong. And then how is the latter 20 feet of your intestines supposed to do what it's supposed to do when the food isn't never had that acid introduction and never got started off the digestive process? So a lot of things go wrong in the surgical aspect of things, but the unfortunate scenario in gastric cancer is it's basically unless the patient gets surgery, there's almost no hope of cure. So it has to be part of the treatment plan. But that's where we come in, is because conventional medicine basically just says you might have to eat smaller portions or you might be lactose intolerant for a couple months, just avoid some dairy. And that's again about the extent of the dietary recommendations. And I mean, is once you start messing with stomach acid, a whole bunch of things can go wrong. So we do a lot of dietary interventions that go along with the surgery.
Yeah, I can imagine there's a lot of downstream effects when you start messing with the any part of the gut. Now, you had mentioned that surgery was often recommended because it's typically found in advanced. Are there early signs and symptoms that people can look out for? I mean, a lot of the signs and symptoms I found were probably more advanced, like weight loss, pain, but that could be anything. Like, how do we differentiate and push somebody to go get screened sooner?
Kind of the tricky part is honestly the getting the doctors to do enough of an evaluation to find it, because usually you're going to be quite symptomatic again, because if every time you put food in your stomach there's a big giant issue, usually patients end up going to the doctor quite quickly because there's a big change in quality of life. um, and a lot of the symptoms, so some of the first symptoms you think of are just anything that you can imagine if there was something growing inside of your stomach. So think about if there's something taking up space inside your stomach, you're going to feel fuller sooner and kind of randomly, right? As like a couple months ago, I could eat all I want, and now suddenly I can only eat half the amount of food that I want to eat, right? Or if you're feeling an obstruction, like you're feeling you swallow food and you feel like it gets getting stuck in a place that it normally shouldn't get stuck down there. Or sometimes even because the stomach is fairly close to the surface, people will notice a little bit of a bulging in that area. So anything that you can imagine taking up space, and obviously depending on where it's taking up space, pushing on other stuff could cause pressure on a nerve, which would cause pain, could cause pressure on your lungs. So your lungs may not inflate as much and cause some shortness of breath. It's just about that. It's just about taking up space. So not always, cancer itself doesn't tend to necessarily hurt a whole bunch, but when you take up space that normally isn't taken up, there's a lot of different kind of symptoms that could happen. The problem is in our system is patients go in and just the medical system will just say, well, take some acid blockers and we'll see what happens. And they kind of get written off a whole bunch. And it's a long time sometimes before the patient will actually get a scope down there, and then they take a tissue biopsy of it, because they'll somewhat scope the throat, they'll scope the esophagus, make sure there's no acid reflux going on, but they don't always necessarily go down into the stomach with the scopes. And again, it's just part of these delays of care of getting the actual diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, there's going to be certain risk factors that are going to make somebody at a higher risk than others. And I would think family history, I was looking at like 5 to 10% was the numbers I found were familial cancer. Does that mean that 85% are what we call sporadic, like environmental?
Yes, and that's actually the case in the majority of cancers. I think people are led to believe that it's a very hereditary sort of disease, and in general, it's not. It's mostly not hereditary. Of course, there are very certain cases. And sometimes that myth is kind of perpetrated by the idea of like, well, my dad got colon cancer and then I got colon cancer, so it must be hereditary. When in reality, it's like, well, your dad ate all the same food that you ate for 40 years. And when you do the same lifestyle, then you end up with the same diseases. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's hereditary, right? So it's kind of the same thing with gastric cancers, is yes, most of it is not necessarily related to your genetics. Um, I will say though that it is a very similar disease to colon cancer, which is quite common. You know, we're talking about the second and third most common cancers depending on gender. But there are even uh, bodies, you know, medical bodies out there that kind of, you have to realize when we say gastric cancer, stomach cancer, that's English. You know, that's us assigning an English word to it based off of kind of where we found it in the body. But what ultimately matters is kind of like the cell types and the mutations and things like that. And really, gastric cancer, most of the time, is almost the exact same cell types as colon cancer. It's just found in a different place in the body. So we call it something different. So when we get into treatment plans, it's all the treatment plans are going to be very similar to colon cancer, which again is much, much, much more common than gastric cancers, but it's just a different location. So when we start looking at the causes and the risk factors, again, a lot of it's going to be things that a lot of people are somewhat familiar with in the gastric cancer world. So low intake of fruits and vegetables, low fiber diets for sure. This is the one time where red meat does come in the mix, and all of my patients come into my office thinking they need to be vegan, and I'm the one that says, please, by God, do not be vegan. You need lots of protein to be fighting back against this disease, to have enough white blood cells. But if there's any studies out there that actually do link some red meat to cancer, it's in the colon cancer world. And again, this is kind of an offshoot of that. But I want to jump in and importantly say that it's not necessarily the red meat itself. It's what we're doing to the red meat. It's when we char the red meat, you know, blacken it on a grill. You could take that same ground beef and roast it in the oven as a meatloaf, and you don't have it as a cancer-causing thing like you do when you turn it into a hockey puck on your grill, right?
Right.
So so yes, there is some association with eating. It's really that. It's that advanced glycosylation end products, the burning of meat, as well as the nitrites and nitrates that are found in like processed meats and bad forms of bacon and all those guys. So that processing of food is certainly associated. Alcohol, definitely associated. And even just again, the physical aspect of you are drinking a caustic thing that's going to irritate the tissues directly. And anytime you are like scratching, constantly irritating a tissue every day over and over and over again, gives risk that some of those cells could turn cancerous. So certainly anything caustic, and alcohol is a good example of that. And then smoking is incredibly highly linked. So everyone thinks smoking with lung cancer, and yes, smoking is certainly linked with lung cancer, but definitely gastric cancer as well as bladder cancer and some other guys, incredibly highly linked with smoking as well.
Any key nutrient deficiencies? I was reading something about vitamin A and C were
Yeah,
important.
that's kind of the funny part of this is it's actually real vitamin A or retinol, right? And the FDA lets food companies and supplement companies label beta carotene as vitamin A, but beta carotene is not vitamin A, it's a pre-vitamin A, meaning if you had a lot of beta carotene, you could maybe turn it into retinol to make sure you have enough retinol so you don't go blind, but it's not actual vitamin A, it's not actual retinol. And the funniest part of this whole thing is that retinol is only found in animal products. So you can get beta carotene, that pre-vitamin A, in fruits and vegetables, but you can't get retinol. And your body only usually makes just enough retinol to kind of, again, prevent blindness from happening. It doesn't do it in large exogenous amounts. So it's kind of like you actually really do need the animal protein in there to get that retinol content. But I get lots of people that try to come in. Again, they've already decided they want to go vegan. They're like, oh, I'm just going to eat all the carrots I can all day long and get all my vitamin A, my beta carotene. I say, look at your hands and your palms are turning orange. The reason they're turning orange is because you're eating nothing but beta carotene and it's not converting into retinol the way that it's supposed to be. So there's your evidence in yourself that you need some actual retinol. So yes, that for sure. And then vitamin C is, again, also just Americans are somewhat bad at getting it because the RDA is so low. Like the government says you need minimal amounts, where like one glass of orange juice basically gets you your RDA. which is enough to not get scurvy. And it's like, yeah, of course, we don't want people to get scurvy and have their teeth falling out, but in terms of optimal health, you'd need, 3 or 4 times higher than the RDA. So getting that in a standard American diet can be hard, but honestly, is getting that in a relatively healthy, somewhat plant-based diet is can be quite doable. You don't necessarily need to supplement.
Okay. So I think those are all important things to cover because I imagine the people that are going to be listening to this are going to be people going through treatment for gastric cancer and or their caregivers, family members. And so I know that a lot of people typically ask what they can do if they have a family member to protect themselves and signs and symptoms to look out for. Um, so how do we support patients going through gastric cancer treatment through surgery, chemo, radiation, and whatnot? I remember you mentioning large quantities of vegetables in our course together. We want all of the fiber for one, antioxidants, prebiotics. Is there anything else in particular you would tack on?
So again, the trickiest part of it comes in what is the conventional system doing,
Mhm.
right? So that's where if someone has had a total gastrectomy, which I think I said in the class, the first time I even heard that was a thing, I thought it was a joke. A total gastrectomy is where they remove the entire stomach on someone. And I was like, you're kidding, right? Like, how are people surviving? But they do, right? And sometimes that's the treatment plan is a total gastrectomy. And when someone has had a complete removal of their stomach, their diet has to 100% change because they have no acid, they have no space to put food in there. And then again, they're not digesting anything you put down there the way that they normally would. So that's, my first answer to your question is you need to get them to a naturopathic oncologist or someone highly trained in working with cancer and food and cancer because this is kind of like not the time to mess around when you have a giant organ that's not there to function the way that you're supposed to, right? And every cell in your body is made from something you ate or drink at one point. So if you suddenly can't absorb a vast amount of your foods, a lot of stuff can go wrong quickly. So that definitely needs professional help. But the patients that haven't gotten to surgery yet, or the patients that maybe they had a partial gastrectomy, only a part of their stomach removed, and they can still eat a decent amount, first and foremost thing that we need to be thinking about is again the B12 side of things. So B12 is a very complicated to absorb nutrient. There's many steps that have to happen to absorb B12, and basically, if any of those steps go wrong, B12 is not getting absorbed in the body. And that's where the first step of B12 absorption is with the stomach producing an enzyme called intrinsic factor. So if you remove tissue that creates intrinsic factor, then you're going to very, very, very much screw up your B12. So that's something that has to be in the mix is again B12 rich foods, which again is only animal protein, right? There's no B12 found in plants. There's a couple of kind of synthetically fermented soy products and things like that that have B12 in it, but when we're talking real food, it's animal protein only. So as long as they have enough acid to be able to handle the protein, and that's where sometimes taking, betaine hydrochloride or some sort of digestive enzyme or acid pill to add more acid to the equation so that they can start digesting their food properly is definitely up there in the big part of the treatment plans for sure.
What about the people that have had a total gastrectomy? Are we talking like do they have like some sort of pouch? Are they just skipping the stomach and going straight to the small intestine? And are you putting them on a liquid diet? Are they doing IVs, injectable vitamins?
So there's not necessarily a pouch. It does. They hook up the esophagus to the small intestines. And it's basically is you have to imagine they don't really have room for a lot of food. So it doesn't always necessarily have to be liquid, but you're going to have a plan where they're eating 10-ish small meals a day just because they don't have enough room to fit anything more in there at 3 meals a day sort of scenario. So multiple small meals per day. And that's where it doesn't necessarily have to be a liquid diet, but usually some supplementing of, high quality protein shakes and meal replacements just helps. So people don't feel like they have to cook 10 meals a day and they can just easily, drink down some of their meals and get some of their calories in there. So I usually do meal replacements for about half of their meal, and then they're eating real food for about half, just to make it doable. Like, obviously I would love it for it to be real food every time, but when you're talking every single day, 10 meals a day for the rest of their life, it has to be doable for people. And then again, injectables when they're needed. So when we look at the things that are poorly absorbed in the body or have a really hard time getting absorbed in the body, it's going to be B12, iron, and calcium are things that are really, really screwed up. The little bit of a tricky part of this, and again, why it's a good idea to work with a professional, is too much of the wrong forms of B12 can actually stimulate cancer growth. So it's not like you can just throw in B12 willy-nilly. But being smart about it, like you said, where yeah, B12 injections are a thing, but you could also do sublingual B12 where we're just kind of skipping the stomach anyway and getting it absorbed into the body. They don't really make sublingual iron because it tastes awful and people don't want to keep it in their mouth. But um, even in the best, healthiest person, iron's only absorbed like 25%. So when we start looking at these patient populations, they're absorbed, 5% less, a very small amount. So a lot of times if they need iron, and again, this is cancer patients who a major problem in cancer is anemia, and it's very common that they need iron. Sometimes they're having to take an iron supplement with almost every meal, or at least making it a iron-rich food. If it's protein, something like that, that the food naturally has a good amount of iron into it, and just often, because again, if they're only going to absorb 5% of it, then you got to keep throwing it in there over and over and over again. And then calcium, which is the tricky part, which again is standard Americans do okay because standard Americans love to eat nothing but dairy. But again, when we look at cancer, dairy is highly associated with cancer growth, so we try to not have it in there. Plus, like I said, it's very common for people to end up lactose intolerant post the surgery, so a lot of times they can't handle the dairy anyway. So it's just finding non-dairy sources of calcium, which there are plenty out there. It's a little bit of training for the standard American.
So we're trying to, if they're not already, shift them from a Western style diet to something more full of fruits and vegetables, whole foods based, but also protein. I'm glad you mentioned that. Fiber, which can be a delicate little dance in the gut, depending on what they have going on and what that looks like. But what about key nutrients? Because I remember garlic, onion, green tea, and astragalus being some of your favorites. And I would love to hear the conversation about astragalus because I know you use it for a lot of different things.
Yes. It's really, I mean, the real answer, and I probably said this in class, that in the oncology world, medicinal mushrooms are never a wrong answer because they always have an immune system issue. And even if they don't think they have an immune system issue, that's why you got cancer because everyone develops cancer cells in their body every day. Your immune system is supposed to clean it up. And for that person, it didn't happen. So clearly there is something wrong with the immune system, right? And when you start throwing chemotherapy in the mix, which just trashes the immune system, is yes, you definitely need medicinal mushrooms. Astragalus isn't actually a medicinal mushroom. We say it's a friend to the medicinal mushrooms because it's a herb that basically has all of the same properties and same constituents that medicinal mushrooms do that are really good for boosting up the immune system. It just happens to not be a mushroom, which sometimes is beneficial because sometimes with mushrooms, people are intolerant or allergic to them, or there's a big problem with quality out there. And there's a lot of mushrooms are a hot topic in the internet healthcare world right now, where everyone is drinking mushroom coffee and teas and all kinds of stuff. And honestly, a lot of the products are made very, very cheaply or with parts of the mushrooms that don't have the medicinal qualities to them. It's very popular that they do something called mycelia product, which is basically where they take some oatmeal or brown rice or something like that and sprinkle some mushroom spores on top of it and then spritz it with water. Then they just take that oatmeal and throw it into a capsule and they call it a mushroom supplement or a mushroom biomass supplement. It's like it's really just oatmeal that happened to have some mushrooms sprinkled on top of it. But because of labeling laws, they get to call it a mushroom product then, even though it's like 0.1% mushrooms in there. So the nice thing about astragalus is it's just an herb. It's just a root of an herb that the label is going to be what the label is going to be. So you can pretty much go with a vast majority of products, and as long as the dosage is high enough that you're going to get some benefit out of it there for sure. Garlic and onions in these cases are somewhat tricky. Just because garlic is one of those hot foods or spicy foods. And again, as once you start messing with digestion process, sometimes people can't handle garlic like they used to. And then onions are kind of a FODMAPy food, and same thing as certain people, especially once you start messing with their organs, they can't handle FODMAPs anymore. So oftentimes it can cause a lot of bloating in there. So that's where I like to stick to the medicinal herbs in that scenario by far. But then specific nutrients for sure, green tea. And green tea is one of those magical things out there. When you look at the research, it's kind of like the more green tea you drink, the longer you live for sure. Up to like the people that drink 5 cups a day live longer than the people that drink 4 cups a day. Like the data is very, very clear. It's incredibly good for cancer. The little bit of the funny scenario, which again is kind of gastric cancer has all these funny scenarios, is one of the most common chemotherapies that's used. It's 5-FU, which is a 5-fluorouracil. It's an abbreviation. 5-FU is almost always used, but it's also used in combination. So some of the chemo regimens are called FOLFOX or FOLFIRINOX. And what I'm kind of getting at is basically anytime you hear an F word in chemotherapy, 5-FU is part of that combination regimen. And green tea does interact with 5-FU a little bit. So that's again where once people start getting on chemotherapy regimens, a professional definitely has to come in the mix, because you can read dozens of great studies about green tea and cancer, but then not realizing that it interacts with their chemotherapy, and people can get into a little bit of trouble.
I also like the use of quercetin, which I use it for a lot of people with like reflux or H. pylori issues. And so it wasn't surprising to see that it was recommended for gastric cancer. And that's found in onions.
Yes, it certainly is. Yeah, as long as people can digest it and they don't get super bloated from the onions, I'm all about it. Right.
Right, right.
Yes.
I guess
Quercetin's used in a lot of cancers, and it really is. A lot of times it's used in a lot of chemotherapy regimens, which is also the nice part of it. I'm not going to say that universally it's okay with every chemotherapy out there, but it does a lot of great things. It works on like 10 different pathways that are relevant in cancer growth. So that's good. Anytime we can kill two birds with one stone. Plus, there are some chemotherapies that it actually concentrates the chemotherapy within the cancer cell. So it kind of like makes the chemo better at killing the cancer cells and less good at killing the healthy cells. So definitely.
And I like that you mentioned some of the frustrations with ordering supplements or herbs because the market is not as regulated as we would like it. And so I think if there was a message that I really wanted to hammer home today would be to just make sure you research the products that you're going to be investing your money and your time taking to make sure that it's actually accurate. And I think one of the biggest signs on the labels is that they don't break down the blend, like what's specifically in it or the amounts. Or a lot of times they'll put proprietary blends and it's like a blend of multiple ingredients, but we really want to know it's all in the dose, like how much of every little thing is in there. And then what are the
Yeah.
studies using and correlating those two? And I don't think people put that together just picking up a supplement over the counter.
Yes, and proprietary blends is honestly a big issue where most of the supplement companies doing that are purposely doing that to try to hide that their product is really not as good as it should be, right? And they make it seem like, oh, it's proprietary. I don't want someone stealing my formula. But, a lot of this stuff is not secrets because they're taking, published studies that exist out there and then making a product out of it. And anyone can go and read those studies. It's not a giant secret. But what they'll do is they'll list 40 ingredients and they'll say proprietary blend of this 40 things. All the government requires is that whatever is listed first is the most common product in there, and then it goes in decreasing order as you go down the list. And a lot of times, the first ingredient will be, spinach or something like that, where it'll be out of a 2.5 gram thing, it'll be 2.4 grams of spinach and then zero point 0.1 gram of 30 other things. And I say it's like licking a piece of turmeric, and there's nothing else in the rest of this stuff. It's just minuscule amounts that they sprinkled in so that they can write it on their product of like, oh, look, we have turmeric and quercetin and everything like that. But there's virtually none of those active ingredients in there for sure.
I also remember you mentioning the eating 10 times a day. For reference, I think most people forget that we typically only eat 3 to 5, some people less actually, if they're fasting or something, but 3 to 5 times a day is usually what I see. So 10 times a day is a lot. When you're supplementing, do you recommend any specific type of protein to supplement with besides avoiding whey or casein dairy?
I like to use, there is kind of like a patented sort of product called hydro beef out there, which is essentially dehydrated cow muscle, or, what I get at is I like the animal protein. So whether it's dehydrated cow muscle or a collagen protein, something like that, I like it because animal protein is best absorbed in the body as compared to other, pea proteins and rice proteins and things like that. You don't absorb all of it. So even if the product says there's 20 grams of pea protein in there, you're not getting 20 grams of protein, even if you had a stomach. And then once we get a stomach out of there, it gets even worse than that. So animal protein is going to give you your best chance about absorbing as much of the protein as possible. But yes, as most animal protein products out there are dairy based, and dairy is associated with cancer growth by far, it's very packed full of lots of growth hormones, and because it's made to turn you into a 2,000 pound bull, we don't want all those growth hormones. So sticking to the cow collagens, muscles, those sort of things are going to be the ideal.
I'm so glad I found another beef lover. I love hydrolyzed beef, and I've been using that protein powder for years now. And it's the smoothest and creamiest and tastiest protein I've had, non-dairy protein I've had. Because these vegan and vegetarian blends tend to come with like a grainy, earthy taste. We just can't avoid if they're a blend. And just the fact that they're a blend, you have to be very cautious of the ingredients, I would imagine, with gastric cancer, just like any other conditions, to avoid, because they're a blend of just so many different things. And with the gut, they don't like those FODMAPs and things like that.
Certainly, as well as a lot of people don't realize. I mean, you could find something wrong with every food, right? And you could vilify every food. Like kale is full of heavy metals, right? And that's where people will go and pick any superfood in the world and find something wrong with it. That's where the answer in medicine, or the answer in nutrition, is always going to be variety. You should not be loading up on 10 pounds a day of carrots or kale or anything, because it has some little bit of an issue. And when you take massive amounts of something with a small issue, that's when it becomes a real issue, right? But when you're looking at something like a protein shake, where if you're doing nothing but pea protein or nothing but brown rice protein or something like that, a lot of these, especially root vegetables and things like that, they do like to suck up a lot of stuff from the soil. And if you're not using an organic product, it's going to be a pesticide bomb, or it's going to have a decent amount of heavy metals in there, things like that. So, I mean, it's kind of the same. If you pick a crappy $5, beef protein or collagen supplement out there, it's going to be the crappiest cows in the world. But pick a good grass-fed cow or organic cow protein, is you're going to do the best you can at keeping the little bit of issues out of there. So definitely in the cancer world is you have to do the best that you can, and that's where variety is going to be the answer. But you don't want to do a root-based protein or a pea protein, something like that, over and over and over and over again, because there's stuff in the soil that you're going to start bioaccumulating.
That's a good point. So when you're putting together nutrition and lifestyle plans for patients undergoing gastric cancer, I imagine there's a caloric requirement, there's a protein requirement, and we're kind of calculating all of those things. We're telling them key nutrients to focus on, things to avoid. Do things change depending on like radiation or chemotherapy?
Yes, because you certainly have to do a healing response. So someone like you that has training in, calculating calories and BMRs, or even some people like have these apps that do it, or they'll go on and do a calculator on Google, something, they'll type in their height and weight and they'll get a calorie requirement, but that's the calorie requirement just to be alive, right? Not to do any activity. And then usually below that, they'll have like 5 different categories where they say minimal exercise, little exercise, a lot of exercise, or Olympic athlete. And they'll add calories to it based on the amount of activity that you're doing. And everything is always focused around exercise, because when you're talking calories, people are thinking about weight, right? But it's really, it's activity, and activity is not necessarily always exercise. Like healing is a giant activity. When you're looking at recovering from a major surgery, when you had an organ removed, that's a lot of cellular activity for your body to build new tissue and heal everything up. When you're going through chemotherapy and it's wiping out your white and red blood cells, there's a ton of activity that has to happen in your bone marrow to build more white and red blood cells. When you're looking at radiation, and it's like, if you've seen bad radiation you get more and more of it, sometimes your skin's falling off and things like that. Think of really bad sunburns. It's like you have to heal up all that tissue every single time. That's a lot of calories to be spent. So yes, I tell people to go to those calculators, find out what their BMR is, which is just basal metabolic rate to be alive. And then, if they are doing exercise, sure, go down the list and pick the next one. But then just because they're going through treatments, whether it's surgery or chemo or radiation, is skip down another one or two to the next one. And they might need, an extra 1,000 calories beyond what the basal metabolic rate is kind of like the baseline. And that's where adding an extra 1,000 calories into people's lives when they're, again, having a hard time eating in general, we haven't even addressed the fact that a lot of them are nauseous because they're getting chemo or radiation, right? So they don't want to eat. Getting an extra 1,000 calories a day can be quite tough. So that's where, again, sometimes we'll look at supplementing with something like MCT oil because it's just a fat, and fat is a very high calorie thing, twice the amount of calories as carbs or protein. So much easier to get that calorie count in there with fat, but you want healthy fat. So MCT oil is a quite healthy fat, usually comes from coconuts or something like that, that you can add in calories well, and cancer has a really hard time using MCT oil types of food, types of fat for fuel source. So that's the thing. You don't want to just be dumping sugar on top of everything. That's why the oncologist will recommend ice cream and hamburgers because they just want the patients to eat as much calories as possible because they do need as much calories as possible. But you don't want to do it with ice cream because the cancer can very easily utilize that glucose and that sugar to fuel growth. So it's being smart about it and picking ways that the cancer can to use.
Yeah, so I imagine it's challenging to figure out how to get the most calorically dense meals into these people all day, every day, spread out into 10 different meals, and then making sure we're picking the right sources. Can you generalize it and say that anti-inflammatory fats like avocados, olives, olive oil in general, are all of these healthy fats okay? Or are there any that we should avoid besides like the obvious saturated fats, pro-inflammatory?
I say picking real foods is always going to be a real answer, right? So I'm actually okay with animal fats for the most part, as which are saturated fats and always demonized as the bad thing. I'm okay with them because saturated fats don't oxidize well, meaning they stay quite stable in the body, where it's really the oxidation of fats that causes the big giant issue. So that's the thing with real butter and lard and that stuff, is you could have it sitting there forever and it never necessarily goes rancid. The saturated aspect of it keeps it relatively non-rancid, keeps it relatively okay. Where when you look at canola oil, which is talked about as the healthiest oil out there for your heart and all this stuff, is it's incredibly, incredibly highly processed. And you can do, I actually used to do this for an assignment for a class I taught, is I would have students go on YouTube and watch one of the, 5-minute clips of one of those shows where they like show how things are manufactured and, show how the factory works and things like that. And we would do an extra virgin olive oil one where they showed how the extra virgin olive oil is made. And multiple times throughout the video, they would say, we do this to make sure no air gets in the product, and we do this to make sure the oil doesn't heat up because that could make it rancid, and we do this where it's in a glass bottle, and we do this where it's in a colored glass bottle so the UV light doesn't get to it, and all this stuff. And then we would go and watch the canola oil video, and literally you hear them say the opposites of all those things, where they say, now we have to heat it up, and now we have to blast a bunch of air into it, and now we have to add chlorine to get rid of the rancid smell because it smells so caustic at this time. It's like all those things that we do to the oils is really what's making it quite harmful. So the natural oils as much as possible, certainly. So that's why olive oil is the thing that it is it's because it's a plant oil that you have to do virtually no processing of it, you just smash it just to be able to get the oils out of there. There's very little that has to happen. And somewhat similar to avocados, it's a quite low processing that has to happen. But you look at seed oils and things like that, as there's a massive amount of seed oil processing that has to occur.
Is there, so then would the Mediterranean diet be the number one recommended diet for you with the gastric cancer specifically?
Yeah, the themes of the Mediterranean diet, and we commonly say Mediterranean diet to patients, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to eat hummus and goat cheese all day long." And I'm saying you don't have to eat as if you were living in Greece. It's just when you look at the whether you want to call it the Mediterranean pyramid or the types of foods that are in there, it's like it is mostly plant-based. There are grains in there, but they're all whole grains. It's not crappy white grains and processed grains and things like that. So it's mostly plant-based, good amounts of fruits and vegetables, a decent amount of cold water fish and seafood, and you get those omega-3 healthy fats for those products. then a smaller amount of like eggs, chicken, and dairy, but most of the dairy is all goat and sheep, which has much lower levels of those growth hormones. And then at the top is red meat. And again, at the top being red meat, it's not they're saying red meat is super unhealthy, is they're saying that just in the Mediterranean, they tend to eat less red meat just because they honestly don't have room for farming billions of cows and everything like that. But again, when they do it, a lot of times they're eating lamb and that sort of stuff that's naturally grass fed too. So it's important to note that it's not red meat free, right? As they are eating a decent amount of it. It's just it's good quality and it's other forms like lamb and goats, things like that.
And what about lifestyle? Do you recommend working out? I mean, I know that can be challenging when people are struggling so much with energy and nausea and things like that.
Exercising is always, if there was anything a cure all in medicine, it would be exercise for sure. It is always a struggle in these patients, but finding something that they can do and they can love is beneficial in so many ways. But yes, it should be critical because of one, the stress aspect of it, right? If you can find an exercise that they love, they get to escape being a cancer patient for a couple hours a day and focus on, forget that. And it's amazingly good for the brain, mental health aspect of things. Two, lymphatics, right? Is your lymphocytes are the white blood cells that fight cancer in your body, and your lymphocytes live in your lymphatic system. And your lymphatic system is a really, really, really low pressure system where basically the fluid inside your lymphatics doesn't move unless you squeeze the muscles on either side. So you have your lymphatic tube here, the muscles are on either side, and it's the contraction of your muscles back and forth that pump the lymphatics and move it around. So if we're talking about boosting up our immune system and getting our immune system to fight cancer, you need to move. There's no other choice but to move because otherwise you can make all the lymphocytes in the world that you want to, and they're just not seeing the cancer cells to kill them off.
So, is there a time and a place for intermittent fasting in gastric cancer or any cancer?
There is, and kind of the easiest way I explain it is the magic number is 13 hours. If you can go into your infusions, your chemo infusions with a 13-hour fast, that's a magic number where your sugars drop for a good amount of time and cancer is kind of opened up. They've opened up the receptors because they're starving at that point. They're ready to go. They're like, gimme, gimme, gimme. And then you go and flood a bunch of chemotherapy into the body, and the cancer kind of goes and eats up a good amount of the chemotherapy. So 13 hours is that magic number. When you start to get over 13 hours, especially in females, you start to pump out starvation hormones and stress hormones and cortisol. So cortisol, stress hormone that one suppresses your immune system, the last thing we want to do. And then two, increases blood sugar floating around in your body. You start turning fat and muscle into sugar to keep the body alive because the body's freaking out at that point. And then you start floating around extra sugar in your body, which one is feeds the cancer, which we don't want. And then two, kind of puts the cancer to sleep because they're like, oh, I just ate a whole bunch. I don't need to be eating anymore. And then you go and get the chemo and they don't absorb up the chemo. So 13 hours is that magic number. And usually in the intermittent fasting world, as people are talking about doing, 16 hours, 18 hours, those sort of things. One thing I want to say that I want people to realize is if you read intermittent fasting studies, almost all of them are done in males. When you look at how many of them are like 400 of them are done in males. So when you look at how many are in females, I think the number is still like two, maybe three studies in females only. And it works very, very, very differently in females. And when people read and about intermittent fasting online and on blogs and websites, is they don't necessarily say that all this data really only applies to males. So you got to make sure that you match the patient population. And that's the rule in cancer in general. People come into my office all day long already taking 20 supplements, and I say, great, this stuff is all great for breast cancer or brain cancer, but you don't have breast cancer or brain cancer. So you need stuff for your cancer. So always making sure whatever you're deciding to do, whatever you're reading about, is for your actual scenario.
So, what are some of the different modalities that your office brings to these patients? Are we talking about red light therapy, infrared sauna use, lymphatic drainage? Like, what are some things that you're adding to conventional medicine treatment to enhance this whole process?
So some of those guys are honestly just a little bit too gentle. I encourage patients if they have red lights or if they have saunas at home, they can certainly do them if we want to. But, we talk about a strength of therapy scale, and if 0 is nothing and chemo is 100, right? A lot of times things like red lights are like a 5, where it's like, sure, it's positive, but is it moving the needle as much as we need it to in a cancer world of things? Not necessarily. Or is it like worth the money? Like, don't go and spend thousands of dollars on a sauna if it's going to barely move the needle. We're a large hyperbaric center, so we do a ton of hyperbaric oxygen, and that's something that on that strength scale would be closer to like a 40, where it's like it's a very gentle therapy, basically no side effects to it, but we're getting a large amount of healing response for it. We're getting a creating an anti-cancer environment because cancer hates oxygen. So flooding the body with as much oxygen as possible is a good thing, right? So anytime we have something that can both be healing but anti-cancer at the same time is what we want to stick to. So we do a ton of hyperbaric oxygen, which people can find. It's not every city might not have access to it, but it's around, it's out there. Kind of the more unique to us, I do have a what's called a local regional hyperthermia machine. So it's a machine that heats up tumors to 116 degrees. We're the closest one to, in the Chicagoland area, we're the closest one for 600 miles that has one of these machines. So there's not as much access to that. But when you heat up a cancer a whole bunch, it releases all this stuff called heat shock proteins, which are basically a flare gun for the immune system. And then the immune system can then, it's like a flare gun that the immune system can see, and it's like, oh, there's something there that I'm supposed to be killing off. Let me rush into there and take a look and see what's going on. So we do a lot of local regional hyperthermia that's paired alongside of chemotherapy or immunotherapy because we can really waken up and point out where the cancer is as the patients are getting their strong therapies. That's a very beneficial thing. It's also good for pain. Um, Obviously, the herbs and the diet part of it, I'm a big herb guy, and there's a lot of data about herbs that can be used alongside of the chemotherapy to make sure that the chemotherapy works as well as possible without as many side effects as possible. And I guess that's what I would say is a lot of people are led to believe that chemotherapy doesn't work, right? Especially when they start looking at statistics in gastric cancers, only 20% or so when they follow standard of care, people are still going to be alive in 5 years. But that's when I say is there's a lot that we can do above standard of care, right? And that number isn't 20% because the chemo doesn't work. Chemo does work. Chemo's really good at killing cancer cells. It's just not good at keeping you alive at the same time. So if we can do all these other things, like hyperbaric, like we do a ton of acupuncture in our office, like we do a lot of lymphatic work in our office, like we have all the herbs to mitigate the side effects of the chemotherapy, then we can not have you die at the same time that you're getting your life-saving treatment. So that's kind of what you want is the best of both worlds is use these treatments that are very good at killing the disease, but then also make sure your body is nice and strong is so that you can fight back.
And obviously, these patients are going to be getting blood draws done regularly. So we don't necessarily want to add more to that. But are you doing nutrient deficiency tests or stool tests to kind of take a deeper look and really customize this? Or how does that work?
Um, Not as much as you may think, and a lot of times it's just because of sometimes cost as patients have so much going on. I would rather them spend money on therapies than more evaluation because they're getting lots of evaluation that I know, we can do a stool testing, but then if in a week they end up switching to a different chemo regimen and like literally some chemos are antibiotics, it's going to totally change the results. Then the patient just spent, $600 on stool testing and we can't use the results anymore. So sometimes it's just logistics that we don't do as much of that. But there are a decent amount of labs that I like to do that don't have to be super costly. And again, a B12 test you can get for like $10. We don't have to spend a ton of money on that. Or same with iron, it's like $10. There are also different growth factors that you can look at. So there's something called insulin growth factor, there's vascular growth factor. So these are hormones that cancer may or may not be producing, saying, gimme, gimme, gimme blood sugar, or gimme, gimme, gimme a blood supply, grow new vessels so I can grow really big, really fast, right? And it's like if someone's vascular growth factor is off the charts, then great, here's a treatment plan to try to shut that down. But if they're not, then I'm not going to build a treatment plan for that. So a lot of the labs we're doing is kind of that. It's really trying to narrow down and target our treatment plan to, okay, you don't just have gastric cancer, but you have this specific gastric cancer that makes a ton of insulin growth factor. Let's build a plan that treats that. That's how patients get better survival outcomes.
And I've been hearing a lot about ozone therapy. Is that something that can be applied here?
We do ozone. It's really just the fact of cancer doesn't like oxygen. So there's many things that you can do in the cancer world that deliver high amounts of oxygen to the tissues. So ozone is a way because ozone is just O3 instead of O2 is regular air, like O3 is oxygen. So there's an extra oxygen molecule that wants to bounce off and go and do stuff when you put it into the body. So we do ozone, but honestly, it's a bit expensive. Most of the time when we're talking ozone therapy, we're talking about what's called major autohemotherapy, MAH, where we pull out a bunch of blood, then pump a bunch of ozone gas into the blood, and then reinfuse the blood back into the patient. Because you can't just pump a gas into somebody's arteries, they would die. They would have a heart attack. So you have to remove the blood, oxygenate the blood, and then add it back into the system is how ozone therapy is does. And that's just kind of labor intensive and it's $300 or $400 depending on where you're getting it done. Where something like hyperbaric doesn't involve more needles, doesn't involve more pokes, right? And they're just sitting in a chair for an hour, and it's a different way to add a whole bunch of oxygen to the tissue. And we charge like $100 for hyperbaric. So a lot of times it's just that it's finding the logistics that work. But people that really come into us because they want to do ozone, I'm sure I don't care how we get the oxygen in there. I want you to get the oxygen. That's actually what IV vitamin C is doing, and that's something that kind of a lot of people have heard about is doing high dose IV vitamin C for cancer. People think that the IV vitamin C is like boosting their immune system because it's vitamin C, and it's not. I mean, that's not really what's happening there. It's really that it's an oxidative therapy. There's so much vitamin C that it carries a large amount of oxygen with it, and the body can't handle that large amount of IV vitamin C, and a lot of these oxygen molecules kind of bounce off, and there's an oxidative response. So it's another way to do oxidative therapies. And again, IV vitamin C is like, maybe $200. So when ozone's 400 and IV vitamin C is 200 and hyperbaric's 100, it's just sometimes picking, what is logistically, doable for patients. But that's actually what radiation therapy is radiation therapy is where they shoot radiation, the laser basically hits the oxygen molecule and the oxygen molecule explodes and causes a bunch of oxidative damage. Like everyone acknowledges that oxygen is good at killing cancer. It's just how do we want to deliver it, to what level do we want to deliver it to, just to get the effects that we want? Because obviously radiation is like a bazooka and you can't keep doing bazookas every day all day long. But hyperbaric, it's such a gentle delivering of oxygen, then we get a healing response at the same time, because the healthy cells like oxygen as long as there's not massive amounts of them.
Okay, okay. So before we wrap up here, because I don't want to go over and keep you too long, but I did have a couple myth or fact questions that I just wanted to run by you.
Sure.
The first one was aspirin and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are associated with a lower risk of cancer in the gastroesophageal junction and other tumors specifically. Do you agree?
Yes, with the nuance. Really just cancer is associated with chronic inflammation. And so if you've been doing things that lower your chronic inflammation, like taking some aspirin regularly, then yeah, you're less likely get some cancers. The problem is the number one side effect of aspirin and other NSAIDs is bleeding stomach ulcers and thinning of the lining of the GI tract. So using a baby aspirin because you're already on it for cardiovascular disease, or aspirin here or there when you're sore, can actually be beneficial. Taking it every day, you're going to destroy your stomach lining. So just dose dependent.
Yeah, that's a good differentiation. And then we kind of touched on alcohol being a risk factor for a lot of different cancers, but I actually ran across this question. So alcohol consumption was demonstrated, has not been demonstrated as a risk factor. And in fact, some data suggested that daily wine intake might be protective despite insufficient evidence.
It's again dosage. So the safe dosage is 2 servings per day for males and 1 serving per day for females. And it's just noting that a serving is 8 ounces of beer, 4 ounces of wine, or 1 ounce of hard alcohol. So literally, if you're a female and you take 2 shots, then you've gone over that and you're actually causing cancer. Where if it was 1 shot or 1 pour of wine, then you're getting a little bit of protective mechanism. So again, it's just Americans are bad at control.
Okay, and then the last one, I thought H2 medications and PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, were associated with an increased risk of gastric cancer, but that came up as a myth or fact question.
No, it certainly is. And you can look for, I can even try to send it to you. We can link it out is there's a big meta-analysis, which is where they take a whole bunch of studies and add the studies together to get like a finalized answer on the topic. There's a big meta-analysis on this in 2022, so fairly recent, that looked at like 30 different studies that had looked at this topic and concluded that yes, they are definitely associated. Some of the studies even showed 2 or 3 times higher rates of gastric cancer in people taking it. I think there was like some conflict of interest, though, is the study conclusion basically says, yes, we are certain that it has it, but maybe we're not because maybe there was some conflict of interest in some of these studies, or maybe there's some bias in some of the studies. So more work needs to be done. And, I kind of look at this and like, okay, it's been studied 30 times over and it's so clear. Like, how many more times do we have to do this? I think what's happening is that the conventional system doesn't want to necessarily acknowledge that these, one of the number one medications that are prescribed in the United States to everybody is causing a major disease. And they're not ready to quite admit that yet because they don't know what they're going to do as a fallback plan if they do admit it.
And whether it's contributing to cancer or not, we know that there's a lot of nutrient deficiencies and stomach acid issues. And so, if we're again kind of going to the root cause of, are you eating enough? Are you breaking it down and absorbing and getting all of the nutrients you need to prevent cancer and protect yourself and stay healthy?
Yeah.
That's a big issue.
Yeah. And people don't realize they're only FDA approved for 2 weeks of use. And it's like, doctor gives them for 2 weeks and then you try, your stomach feels great. Then after 2 weeks, you try to come off of them and your stomach hurts again. The doctor's like, I don't know. Okay, I guess go back on them. And then you're on them for 20 years. And that kind of, again, that's the problem is 2 weeks of use the biggest deal in the world? And could it be used if you have an ulcer? Sure. Right. But you can't be on these things for 10 years because you're going to screw up everything. You screw up your calcium and iron and B12 and all the absorption of everything else. So the list of side effects is massive because you're going to get 20 different side effects of B12 deficiency, 20 different side effects of iron deficiency. It goes and goes and goes.
Well, thank you so much for pointing out those differences and giving your insight to us and everybody that's going to be listening. Was there anything you wanted to add that we didn't cover?
I guess the one thing something that we do offer that I kind of skipped over, that's what my third office is about, is I'm part of another office called the Ayer Clinic. We're the oldest low-dose chemotherapy clinic in the United States. So there's only about 30 low-dose IPT, what's called insulin potentiated therapy, low-dose chemotherapy clinics in the US. So it's where we use chemotherapy in very, very, very small amounts, but we take advantage of the fact that cancer likes sugar, inject the patients with insulin, mix a tiny amount of sugar with a tiny amount of chemotherapy, infuse it into them, and then the cancer goes and eats up most of the chemotherapy. So it's a way to do chemotherapy without having all the massive side effects of the drug regimen. So that's what I'm getting at too, is sometimes there are patients that no matter what we do, is they just can't tolerate the standard of care. And that's where I'm saying is there are other options. There are ways that we can use these life-saving medications without destroying your body at the same time. So obviously, again, there's only 30 clinics across the US. Not everyone has access to them, and you'd have to fly in somewhere to get them. But I just want to use as an example of a lot of times there's dozens of other therapy options that exist that just sometimes your doctor's not telling you about because they don't know that it exists. So talking to someone that has the ability to say, like, and it's not always necessarily with us, as I refer out to other doctors all the time that do dozens of different cancer therapies that we don't necessarily do. But again, is they're not hearing from them from their big University of Chicago system or whatever it is, because University of Chicago doesn't have that machine or doesn't have that type of doctor that does that therapy. So there's a lot out there. So if you're not happy with your standard of care, certainly explore options.
Yeah, that's a good message to have. I mean, everybody is so unique and different. We want to make sure we support them the best we can, even if it's not with us.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for listening to the Sky Therapeutics podcast with your host, that's me, Tara Torres. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to check out any bonus info and links in the show notes. You can visit us at www.skytherapeutic.com or find us on social media because we love connecting with our audience. Until next time, be well.